Welcome to another edition of Life, Love, and Philosophy. This is the 12th in a series of programs I'm doing on human nature and what famous thinkers in philosophy, psychology, literature, religion, and science have said about it. There has been much research done in recent years on the human genome, and this research has fueled the long-lasting debate concerning nurture versus nature. In other words, is human behavior shaped mostly by our genes or mostly by the environment in which they live? Well, there are big-name academics on both sides of the debate. Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson and MIT professor Steven Pinker come down on the side of genes. They emphasize the role of genes in shaping human behavior, whereas former Harvard professor Stephen Jay Gould and University of Pennsylvania professor Arthur Caplan emphasize environment in shaping human behavior. I must add, though, that there is common ground. Science writer Erica Good, writing in the New York Times, said this: "No one denies that both genes and environment shape our behavior. The important question is the relative balance of culture and genes in determining human behavior." Gene Robinson is a professor at the University of Illinois. He is, in fact, the director of the neuroscience program at the University of Illinois. And Professor Robinson talks about how genes are affected by the environment, how genes are affected by how they interact with the environment. He points out that genes can provide a wide array of outcomes depending on the environment in which they are activated. Professor Robinson points to animal studies to indicate the role of environment as an influence on genes. He says, and I'm quoting him, "Some genes that are affected by environment have long-lasting consequences. Rat pups, for example, that are poorly cared for by their mothers." Again, rat pups, poorly cared for by their mothers, show profound changes in brain gene activity and turn out to be poor mothers themselves. Well, the question is, if rat pups who are poorly cared for by their rat mothers show profound changes in brain gene activity, can something similar happen to human infants? And Professor Robinson, again, who is director of the neuroscience program at the University of Illinois, answers in the affirmative. There is a consensus in psychology, philosophy, religion, and literature that aggressiveness seems to be a trait of human nature, and that this aggressiveness often results in harm to other human beings. Since we are not solely products of our genes, but also our environment, what might be done to improve human behavior, to reduce our tendencies towards aggressiveness, for example? Well, I have mentioned in past programs that both religion and education have a role to play here, that both religion and education can promote introspection among human beings, examination of one's conscience, for example, and that also religion and education can promote empathy in the world and also promote compassion in the world. And some people believe that religions do a valuable service in perhaps putting the fear of God in people, that perhaps fearing God's wrath, fearing a possible judgment day, for example, might induce some people to behave better and to reduce their aggressiveness. Indeed, the French intellectual Voltaire said something that is very germane here. Voltaire said that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. He went on to say that whether God exists or not, he would want his lawyer, his baker, his wife to all believe in God because he believed that if they did, they would all treat him better. Today's program will zero in on other environmental factors that might encourage better human behavior. Mencius, that's M-E-N-C-I-U-S, Mencius, very famous Chinese philosopher of antiquity, emphasized the role of the environment and specifically the importance of having a just social order. He said, a just social order provides opportunities for making a decent living. And this Chinese philosopher went on to say that if people cannot earn a decent living, it will be difficult for them to maintain good hearts. Bertrand Russell, the famous 20th century British philosopher, was in a sense a modern-day Mencius. Russell believed that if we want people to behave better towards each other, it's very important that people be provided with more economic security. Philosopher Bertrand Russell believed that in the minds of men especially, and especially in the minds of married men, is a lurking fear of what might happen to their wives and children should they lose their jobs, should they go broke. Russell contended, since many men have this lurking fear in their minds, it means that very often, or I should say it results very often, in them treating other people less than kindly. But Russell contended that if these men had more economic security, if they knew that if they lost their jobs, or if they went broke, or something terrible happened to them, if, for example, they died, if they knew that their wives and children would be taken care of, especially in an economic way, that they would tend to treat other people more kindly. That again, providing them with more economic security would tend to diminish their aggressiveness and perhaps increase their kindness. What do you think? It's also true, by the way, that Jesus and some other philosophers, in one way or another, said something similar to Bertrand Russell. Jesus and some others talked about good soil and bad soil, and that when you plant seeds in good soil, well, generally speaking, something good will result from planting good seeds or planting seeds in good soil. But if you plant even good seeds in bad soil, well, the consequences probably will not be good consequences. What did Freud say on this matter? Specifically, what did Freud say about getting people to treat others more kindly and more fairly? Well, let me give you Freud's own words. He said, "I think it is quite certain that a real change in the relations of human beings to possessions would be of more help in this direction than any ethical demands." Freud believed that people's attitudes towards accumulating possessions and the idea that many people define themselves by their possessions in one way or another contributes to aggressiveness in the world. I must mention, by the way, that Freud was not a communist. Freud was not a communist. Is Freud correct, by the way? If people didn't define themselves by their possessions, would they treat each other better? Is there a rat race for possessions? Does this contribute to people's aggressiveness? Again, Bertrand Russell, I think, has some words of wisdom here. Russell talked about people's struggle for success. And here are his own words, which I think are illuminating. This famous English philosopher said the following: "What people fear when they engage in the struggle for success is not that they will not get their breakfast next morning, but rather that they will fail to outshine their neighbors." Are there cultural influences, environmental influences, that tend to promote the idea that you are what you own, that encourage people to define themselves by their possessions. I think it's fair to say that the media has a significant influence on the behavior of a large number of people, and that advertising and television in general often equate possessions with smiley faces. So often in advertising and in television programs, you tend to see a relationship between having certain possessions and being happy. Indeed, if you look at certain television advertisements and even print advertisements for cell phones, you might see 4 people in the advertisement, mother, father, 2 children, all of whom have cell phones, and again, they're smiling in a way in which one rarely sees people smiling. The idea is that these cell phones are going to dramatically increase their happiness. And cell phones are just one of many examples I think one can give of how, again, advertising and television promote the idea that we are what we own, and that the key to happiness is owning more things. I think it's also fair to say that the music industry, in some way or another, often again encourages this idea. Some rap artists, for example, in their music, in their videos, promote the idea that the good life is one based on having a lot of sex and a lot of possessions. That again, the key to living better is sex and materialism. And so often, I think it's fair to say, many of our contemporary music artists never talk about the role of integrity and expanding one's consciousness in terms of living a better life, a more fulfilling life. Indeed, both Confucius and Plato believed that music could have such a significant influence on people that both Confucius and Plato believed the government should censor music. I want to add, by the way, parenthetically, I very much disagree with Confucius and Plato on the idea of censoring music. I do agree with them that the music we listen to and that young people listen to, for example, has an enormous potential influence on them. Is it true that people who occupy power slots in the television, advertising, music, and movie industries really are, in a sense, the high priests and priestesses, is that a word? I think it is, priestesses of our society, and that these television executives, advertising executives, music executives exercise more influence over morals in America than the most important clergy people? It's a fact, for example, that U.S. children spend more time watching television than they do in class. The latest surveys on this indicate, and I'm quoting from a recent survey, U.S. children average 900 hours a year in class and 1,023 hours in front of a television. And of course, this does not include the hours young people are spending on the internet. If it's true that the media has some negative influences on society, as well as some positive influences, well, the question then becomes, is there any way, any possible way, to try to counter the negative influences of the media? I think the answer is yes. I'm quite confident the answer is yes. And so much of it has to do with education. For approximately 15 years, I taught a course to young people in which we analyzed the possible negative and possible influences of television, advertising, music, and movies. And I must tell you, when you start talking about such subjects, it's very easy to motivate young people and even get them to read significant articles, some of them scholarly, on the subjects of television and advertising, among others. I think that the typical social studies curriculum in the United States is antiquated. I believe it emphasizes, in fact, I know in most areas of the United States, it emphasizes history and political science to the exclusion of some other important social studies subjects. By the way, this is not to say it's not important for American students to study history and political science. It's extremely important that they do that. But it's also very important that kids, even at the junior high school level, begin studying some psychology, some sociology, and some philosophy. Imagine going through 12 years of public education and never having your thinking stimulated about what might be some of the influences of television, advertising, movies, music, and the internet on oneself. I think anyone's education is very inadequate if one's education has not encouraged oneself to think about the influences of the media. Again, positive and negative, possible positive and negative influences of the media. If we are to get human beings to behave better towards each other, less aggressively, for example, perhaps the French philosopher Voltaire was onto something when he suggested that one way to accomplish this is by having saner customs, wiser customs. He believed customs have a great impact on human behavior. Well, I've suggested in past programs, and we'll give some new suggestions today about some customs we might institute in America that might impact on human behavior. I suggested in a past program, for example, that I think all report cards, K through graduate school in Harvard, or at Harvard, all report cards in first place should list the subject decency, fairness, and kindness. It should be in a box on the report card, the first box listing subjects: decency, fairness, kindness. And as I indicated in a previous program, I don't think any teacher, any professor has the right to give anybody a grade in this area. So what's the purpose? Well, the idea was there'd be no grade. The idea is each person would have his or her thinking stimulated about the idea that what's even more important than being a good student in history, in philosophy, in mathematics, is being a decent human being. So many of the great philosophers have said that character is far more important than intellect. Character is far more important than intellect. Also, I suggested in a past program that teachers, or perhaps the principal, at the beginning of every semester on the PA system might remind the students that the only major rule in the school, major rule, is that all of us, staff and students, will try to treat each other fairly and kindly. And perhaps they might make this announcement on a monthly basis, again, just to remind students of the importance of everybody trying to treat each other kindly and fairly. Isn't this much better, for example, than instituting school prayer? Indeed, school prayer is so controversial, gets a lot of people angry. I'm not suggesting that it might not even be a good idea if it were done properly. If it were done properly. However, it might even be unconstitutional. So why have this debate about school prayer? Well, we don't need school prayer, I think, to get people to behave more decently towards each other. If schools and universities, again, would emphasize through their professors, through their administrators, the importance of everybody treating each other kindly, that would be a good substitute for school prayer. Another custom that could be introduced in America that I think might have a very beneficial effect is this. We could make the most prestigious team in every junior high school, in every high school, in every university in America, the all-volunteer team. The all-volunteer team would consist of students who do volunteer work in nursing homes, in soup kitchens. They would work in literacy programs, teaching people how to read. They would volunteer in clean up the neighborhood programs. Isn't it interesting that in the southern part of the United States, which is considered by many people to be the heart of the Bible Belt, that so often in so many southern communities, the most prestigious junior high school team and high school team is the football team. In fact, you probably know in some areas of the South, they have pretty large stadiums in which junior high school football teams and high school football teams play under the lights on Friday nights before a very large audience. Sometimes the games are televised. Well, could devoutly religious Southerners object to the all-volunteer team replacing football team as the most prestigious teams in its schools? Such a team could also help students to increase their empathy and compassion by coming into contact with needy people. And also, such a team could convey the message to kids that helping people is more important than beating people in competition. Also, the all-volunteer team could help kids to experience the joy of being of service to other human beings. Another custom, I think, that might be introduced into America to make us a more loving country, a country of more warm-hearted people, is the following. Let's have a custom of honoring whistleblowers in the business world, in government, in education, honoring them with statues, with portraits in City Hall, and with medals. I mentioned in a previous program, I know of no whistleblower who has been honored by any president, Republican or Democrat, at the White House with a Medal of Honor. Why is this? Why don't we confer greater honors, again, on whistleblowers in business, in education, in government, who risk their careers, sometimes their reputations, sometimes their lives, to expose dishonesty, to expose inefficiency in business, in government, in education? I think I know what some of you viewers are thinking now. You're saying to yourselves, Phil, this is pie-in-the-sky idealism. The idea of the all-volunteer team being the most prestigious team at the typical high school. The idea of honoring whistleblowers with statues and medals, and also with appearances at the White House. Well, maybe you're right. Here is my response. The U.S. is supposedly one of the most religious nations on earth. We have a higher proportion of churchgoers and synagogue-goers and mosque-goers than most countries in the world, indeed than any Western European country. Also, our current president, President Bush, has said that Jesus is his favorite philosopher. Well, if these ideas that I've suggested could never take hold in America, doesn't that speak volumes about how religious, how spiritual we really are? One of the words Jesus used more than a few times, was hypocrite and hypocrisy. Could it be that there is much more hypocrisy among Americans, even religious Americans, than we would like to admit? What do you think? So many famous thinkers have claimed that human beings like to think that they are more moral than they are. Indeed, St. Augustine and Freud, an atheist, both agreed on this. that human beings tend to think they are better, more decent than they really are. Jesus and Buddha also at the very least implied this. Will Durant, a famous historian on the subject of truth, said this. He said, human beings often don't like the truth. Here are his own words, historian Will Durant. There are few things in the world so unpopular as truth. And the backbone of men and states is a concatenation of romance. Henry Adams, very famous Harvard professor and also historian, said this. The world can take only small doses of truth. Too much truth would kill it. And of course, there is the famous English proverb, the truth hurts. What do you think? If society is going to attempt to get people to behave better towards one another, I think perhaps it's also important that we think more deeply about the word manly and what it should connote, and the word beautiful as opposed to women and what it should connote. I'll have much more to say about this next week. But again, I leave you with the idea that I introduced by way of Voltaire, the French philosopher, who believed that one way to improve human behavior, to get people to behave less aggressively towards one another, is to introduce saner, wiser customs. And I think he does provide some food for thought here. And if you have any ideas concerning this, please email me your suggestions. Finally, I'd like, as usual, to end with a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau claimed that we are all artists. In his masterpiece, Walden, he wrote the following words. To affect the quality of the day, that is the highest of arts.